We'll address any questions that you have about data mining and predictive analytics. This is the free consulting segment of our webinar, Open Access to Gurus. Scott, like I said, Tony's teaching a class today, so he had to depart. In his place is another phenomenally seasoned senior consultant, Scott Clendaniel. So we have two great Scotts with us to give different perspectives in the Q&A. So, like I said, we have a number of questions. We don't have too much more room for more, but this is your best chance, if you do have any other questions, to go ahead and get them in the queue. We'll read as many as we can aloud. And I've got to be a little more gracious this time, Scott Terry, where I was kind of hogging the mic or taking the first response to each question each time, and I'll try to work myself into the rotation. So let's start with a question from Varun. I understand that a combination of all will always be great, but what do you consider a requisite for a newcomer to enter this industry, specifically amid a career professional? Varun, I would say that there's, and let me relate this, I think you have a second part question. I want to know, what is the crux of data analysis predictive modeling? Is it mathematics, stats, or the analysis tools, or is it the domain knowledge? I would have to say on both of these, it's probably the right balance or mix of all of the above, and probably the best way, and I know this sounds a little self-serving, but probably the best way to get a good representation of the overall approach is to take more of the bird's eye view. And if you're here in the U.S., certainly TMA's full course series would be the way to do that. That way, again, you're tackling that spike in the learning curve, you're seeing the full process, you're getting to see the proper emphasis of strategy versus tactics, how do the methods compare, why do you not want to start with software? All those things are addressed so that you can make a more purposeful and balanced approach and understand what really requires emphasis across the board. Let me start with Scott Terry. Any advice you'd like to give to Varun as far as what's the best way to get started in data mining, and what should you really pay attention to first?
Well, Varun, I think that's a critical question, and I would echo what Eric said wholeheartedly. The first thing is to kind of get a good, solid survey and basis of understanding of what it's all about. Then I would say, you know, to do a little bit of a variation of what Eric mentioned, there are basically two areas from a broad perspective that you can go into. And one of those areas is more IT-oriented, computer science-oriented, where you're actually being an engineer. You're developing the algorithms and creating new ones. So it's more of an IT-focused kind of thing. And the other is on the application side. The application side is, both sides are actually exploding. There's a lot of opportunity in both of them. But it really depends upon which broad area you want to go into. If you go in, I use a kind of an auto racing metaphor when I talk about this. Some people want to actually work on the cars and build the motors and make sure that the car's running, and then other people want to be race car drivers. So that's probably a good metaphor for what we're talking about. If you want to be a race car driver, from that point on, it's good to get a good education. I mean, it's not a requirement, but it's a good thing to have, because if you're just breaking into the industry, credentials help, and certainly training helps. But then you might want to specialize in certain areas. For example, it's as broad as going into bioinformatics all the way to marketing to finance, a whole lot of different areas you can go into.
Great considerations. I think I've heard that metaphor before. Thanks, Scott. And Scott Clendaniel, would you like to add any cautions or advice?
Sure. The first thing I would do is change whatever my existing job title is to data scientist and use the phrase big data a lot. Because for whatever reason, the stuff that all of us have been working on for the past 14 years has, in the course of the past 18 months, sort of been reinvented, and now all of a sudden it's chic and popular. It's the exact same stuff, so I don't know what happened there. The one thing I would throw out is any opportunity that you have to look over the shoulder or work with someone else who is doing an existing project, even if you can only spend short amounts of time with them, so you can really get a feel for what's happening and what the actual projects are and what the actual workday looks like, I would start there for two reasons. One, it's a great way to garner some practical information in terms of what actually goes on in a day-to-day basis to see if this is really what you're interested in. And two, you can also pick up a lot of fantastic information on ways to go about solving problems that you might not necessarily pick up through a strict college program. There are my two thoughts.
And great thoughts they are. And if we had an hour of Q&A, we could all go into our rant about the overhype of big data. And yet it is preparing a good landscape for analytics. You know, everyone can say, you know, thanks big data, now I'm even more data rich, but nobody's really that much more information. You know, there's still information poor. So, don't get me started on the data scientist label. There's actually an article that I'm writing that will be published in Q1 entitled Big Data Needs Advanced Analytics, but Analytics Doesn't Need Big Data. And within that article, I go over some of the, I think, the misconceptions around and the mislabeling of data scientist itself from a couple of different perspectives. So we'll have to go on with the targeted questions here, but something to look at. Let me start this next question again with Scott Terry. It relates to our training class, and if you want to go back to Sukitra for more information, Sukitra asks, is structured equation modeling considered a type of predictive modeling approach? Do you teach that in any class? Structured equation modeling. Scott Terry, do you know what Sukitra is?
Yeah. The answer to the first part of the question is it can be. Certainly, you see. Well, let me answer the first. The answer to the first part of the question is yes, and the answer to the second part of the question is no, we don't. What we want to do in the course is we want to lay the fundamentals. You know, if you know the fundamentals, that's 90% of the game. Everything else is a theme and variations. Now, going back to the first part of the question, it was alluded to by Scott Clendaniel about the explosion of big data and data science. I see this whole industry as really an evolutionary industry rather than revolutionary. In other words, it just didn't start yesterday. So we see a host of new algorithms and new techniques coming on board, which is expanded to include things that haven't been more traditional statistics. In earlier years, we got out of statistical-based models. We've started to incorporate some things from operations research. Structural equation modeling is definitely one of those areas, but it's not a fundamental area.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair to say, and thanks for helping me interpret structured equation modeling. I thought it was going back to my comment in the opening. There's a slide that says, I no longer use neural networks to balance my checkbook. Wasn't sure if the structured equation modeling was more about actually finding a right answer as opposed to an optimal answer, but or an optimized answer. But no, that's a great explanation. Scott Clendaniel, anything to add?
Not entirely. I was taught in my incredibly brief entertainment career never to follow acts that involve children or animals because you were bound to fail. I'd like to add a third, which is just incredibly nice geniuses, in which Scott Terry falls into, because I got nothing.
Well, not a wrong answer, because we all have our areas of specialty, and there's a lot of questions. So we can, you know, if not for this one is not a wrong answer by any means. So let me go to Sarah. Thanks. I'm glad you were able to stick around a bit, and so let's make priority of getting to your question. And I'd like to since we like clustering in our profession, I'm going to group it with another kind of related question. So Sarah, you asked on your webinar sign-up, do you recommend specific statistical tools for models describing employee data, for example, turnover or workforce planning? And there's another related one from Mikkel. What use of PADM have you seen or can you foresee in K-12 education systems? I'll tell you what, let me refrain, and let's start with Scott Clendaniel this time, how you lump those two together. Maybe it was unfair to lump them. But Sarah looking at employee workforce planning, and Mikhail in using analytics in K-12 education systems.
Great questions. What I would suggest is that there are different ways to be able to categorize problems, and categorizing them by industry isn't necessarily the way I would go first. Usually what you're trying to do is figure out three kinds of things. One is, what is the objective? Two, what type of dependent variable are you trying to predict? So for example, are you trying to put things into categories? Are you trying to put things in group? Are you trying to predict a continuous outcome like employee turnover or dropout rate among high school students? And then the third is, what do you have available in terms of resources to apply to the problem? The reason I throw that out is those elements are going to be much more helpful in helping you decide which type of algorithm you're going to select. It actually, ironically, doesn't vary that much, in my opinion, from industry to industry. It varies much more in terms of the answers to those other three elements I just laid out.
No, absolutely, and I often tell people that the actual industry vertical or the application itself, it's a very thin veneer. Once you strip that away, it comes down to, like you say, one of four basic types of analytic approaches, and then it comes down to resources mapping to objectives and other things. And when it comes to the methods involved, well, not only if Tony were here, I'm sure you would both being strategic experts as well, back up the fact that it's much more important to ensure that you're targeting the strategic objectives as opposed to just optimizing a model. And yes, methods selection does have impact, but if you're building excellent models that answer the wrong questions or are off the target or fail to address a host of other strategic aspects, you might be building a great model that ultimately is doomed at the project level. Scott, Terry, anything else you'd like to add for Sarah or Mikhail?
Well, I'll underscore a couple of things. I agree with everything that's been said, and the most important thing is defining the problem. The differences from one industry to another is basically veneer. If you know the techniques and you know how to define the problem correctly, then that's 90% of the game. I'd underscore and emphasize, because in these sessions we typically get a software question. It's really not about the software as much as people think it is. The algorithms that we actually employ have an IQ of 0. They're dumb. So what that puts the burden on is the analysts themselves to actually define the problem correctly, structure the define the objective correctly once they've defined the problem, and then just to structure the data properly in terms of the data preparation. That's probably anywhere from 50 to 75% of any total project time. You do that right, the algorithm and accordingly the software is the least important part of it.
That's right. It reminds me that I love your image of Homer's brain, not Homer the Greek, Homer the Simpson, referring to how software can really understand your problem. So the next question from Tassos relates to your part of the presentation, Scott, Terry, around outliers, and I know Scott Clendaniel, a ton of experience around this as well. And I think we'll make this at 1:15. We'll make this final question, and we'll look over the other questions that were submitted to us. We're leaving a lot on the table here that we can respond by email. So Tassos asks two-part questions. You touched upon outliers and the way they affect statistical analyses. What are the best practices when there will be cases where outliers would be part of the analysis? Absolutely. I mean, we don't want to just lop them. A lot of times they're the points of greatest interest. For instance, I'm analyzing data samples for determining tumor marker concentration with patients with ovarian cancer. It's unclear how to properly transform data in order to have a better fit. In your example, you used logarithmic transformation. How did you come up with that? Start with Scott Terry.
Well, the short answer to that is experience. But that's certainly not the only way to deal with outliers. First of all, you have to, I think you kind of alluded to it in your question, it goes back to the problem definition. Is the outlier the problem, or is the outlier a problem? That's an initial distinction you need to make. Sometimes we're actually trying to predict outliers. We're trying to understand what drives those outliers. Other examples that are a little bit easier to digest is when we look at fraud detection or spam filtering and text mining. What we're trying to do is we're trying to identify the exceptions rather than the rules. So in that case, it is the problem. In other cases, when we're trying to develop a model that generalizes well to other data sets, then an outlier can be a problem. In both cases, you want to try to understand them and to deal with them, and it's a whole course in terms of dealing with outliers. I mean, we could speak for easily for a couple of hours in terms of those. But the fundamental thing goes back to the problem definition. You need to determine whether the outliers are a problem or the outliers are the problem that you're trying to address.
Great point, Scott Terry. And like you've been saying for quite a while, as much as we have, a 40-hour training week, it's always been a struggle as to how to balance all the topics, because we're always struggling for enough time to go deeply enough into all the different aspects that we have for the full week. And we found some ways to do that, taking core concepts to offline out of the classroom as a basic training that you can take as a prerequisite just by playing it online and then coming to the training course. But it's always a struggle, and like you say, you could spend a lot of time just on outliers themselves. But Tassos, thanks for asking that question, because one of the things you don't want to do is just assume that because they are kind of off scale, that it's a read error or a sensor failure or whatever. That there are applications, like we say, that those oftentimes have some of the greatest information in them. Scott Clendaniel, you've had your share of dealing with outliers. And if you want to take this even to another application space, there have been a lot of questions coming in about social data, any experiences that you have that can relate to that. And let me add, Tassos just wrote, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, thank you all. That was very informative and an interesting event. I'll follow up with you with some other questions. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. So Scott Clendaniel, any other way you'd like to address outliers, and feel free to go over to any other application space.
Sure. Yeah, outliers are one of the things that I think professors like to use to terrify people, in that all an outlier really means is that it's more than 3 standard deviations from the norm, in which case, usually when I say that, everyone in the room, you can see their eyes start to drift as they're like, what? But the only point I would start to make on that is outliers have a specific definition in relation to what is a normal distribution of data, and most of the problems that you're going to solve have nothing to do with normal distributions of data. And what that means is outliers have specific sets of techniques that you should address in specific situations, but just because it's an outlier isn't by itself necessarily all that important, in that if you're not dealing with something that starts with a normal distribution, like sample from a population, it's not necessarily going to all that often. What you're basically trying to do is identify, is there something so odd about this particular record or case or situation that we need to handle it differently? I would say that maybe at the outside 5% of all the time I've ever spent with data on predictive models involves anything that needs to be addressed with outliers per se. So I wouldn't worry too much at this point about those. You need to address them in terms of data preparation steps. And to keep from boring everyone into a stupor, I'm going to stop there.
And sometimes I guess when we're working with the domain expert, it's a good idea to ask them about the behavior because again, it may be something that they understand why it happened and why it's of interest. Or, yeah, it's an error and it's going to affect accuracy of the model. And, you'll know how to handle it at least if the modeler is not completely familiar with the problem domain. So great advice. So with that, and at nearly 20 after the hour, we're going to draw this event to a close, but I'd certainly like to thank our attendees today for your sustained interest. We had phenomenal retention. Still, at 20 minutes after the hour, we've got about 65% of those who joined us at the beginning. So we're grateful for that, and your active participation on those polls. We got up over 80% very quickly every time. Certainly Scott and Tony for your great segments, and Scott and Scott for your valuable and entertaining question and answer contributions. And some of these were pretty tricky today. They were sophisticated questions, particularly for a group who define themselves as mostly investigators and beginners. And Scott, you had phenomenal responses to each of those, and we had a number of compliments coming back to each of you for your responses. So thanks so much for your Q&A contributions. Now we'll follow up with the group with an email shortly with some resources and suggestions that will hopefully be useful to you. From there, we'll hope that you've already offered permission for us to stay in touch through the Modeling Agency's newsletter. Actually, the Q3 issue, or I'm sorry, Q4 issue goes out today, so you'll be receiving that actually in a little bit. That's just completely by coincidence. It just goes out once a quarter. And after that, we'll hope that you'll consider joining us at a public training event soon. Now remember that you can save 20% on your Orlando course series registration if you sign up by the end of the month, December 30th, for the Los Angeles production. I'm sorry, that's for Orlando, and then the Los Angeles production if you register by January 24th. Now, if you would like to benefit from your early efforts, instead of just reducing the bill for your organization, we can hand you up to $200 in Visa gift cards at the course instead for your own personal use. You can select which discount you'd like to receive in the online registration form, and don't forget that your colleagues can join you anytime for up to 30% off. Now, if you don't have a training or travel budget but would like the guidance of a seasoned mentor like Scott or Tony, you might be interested in the Modeling Agency's Wire Support program. Wire Support is essentially a retainer account that provides remote open access to a TMA senior consultant. Simply open up a Wire Support account. You can even do that instantly online. And you've added a wealth of experience and capability to your existing bench without expanding payroll, administrating complicated contracts, or taking elevated risk on larger commitments. We'll get you the answers you want, guide you through it, show you how it's done, implement any data mining tasks you may wish to delegate, and then we'll remain on call until the next time that you need us. And meanwhile, when we're not actively working, you're not paying a dime. So a link to the Wire Support description page will be among the resources included in the follow-up email. Most of them are not promotional. They're just great references. On behalf of myself, Tony, Scott, and Scott, thank you again for attending Data Mining Failure to Launch. Have a very pleasant afternoon, and this brings the webinar broadcast to a